All right, guys, let's wrap up viruses, finally. So one of the things I had pointed out several times is that, remember, there are viruses that infect every type of organism. Fungi, plants, particular animal species, humans. A type of virus that only infects bacteria is called a bacteriophage. And I'd kind of mentioned this before, but this is what it looks like. It has, it reminds me of a spider, which really creeps me out. But basically, the little daddy long legs there are what aid in attachment. And then the virus actually sits down. It has these little tail pins, and it has enzymes that will eat through the bacterial cell wall. And then it just basically, inserts, or in my word, poops its nucleic acid into the bacterial cytoplasm. And then what you're left with is actually, I call them little ghost ships. So the nucleic acid is in here. The virus really doesn't have to uncoat or go through, dissolving its capsid, because everything is left out on the outside. So phages are interesting. There's been a lot of research done on them. Could they be used in terms of, drug delivery? One interesting article that I read recently is that researchers have shown, and I can find the exact paper reference if you're interested in reading about this, just let me know. But basically, if you have a superbug, which are antibiotic resistant bacteria, if you infect that superbug with a bacteriophage, it ceases to be a superbug, basically. So it's kind of like the bacteria can either fight off, the antibiotics and be able to destroy those, or it can try to fight off attack by the bacteriophage, but it can't do both. So if you can infect bacteria with a phage, and it's MRSA will cease to be MRSA, and now other antibiotics that are effective against Staph aureus will work. So I think that's super interesting research that's happening. But anyway, bacteriophage, type of virus that infects only bacteria. So here's an E. coli cell, and all of these are bacteriophages, and here it's gone through a lytic cycle and basically, caused the bacteria to lyse. I mean, you almost feel sorry for it a little bit. Well, not really, because it's E. coli. Okay, so how do we grow up and cultivate viruses? And it can be any type of virus, but we're talking about animal viruses, meaning that they're ones that infect humans, dogs, cats. And specifically, when we say animal viruses, usually because we're, talking about human health, we're talking about human viruses. So here's what makes it tough, and this is why we can't do a virus lab at Kirkwood where we're actually cultivating viruses. And it's because, remember, viruses can only replicate themselves when they are inside a living cell, because they have to, use all of the cell's machinery. So for us to be able to do a virus lab where you're actually, having viruses replicating, we would have to have a sterile cell culture facility, which is, your lab fees would be literally like $10,000 a month for us to be able to maintain that. So that's why we don't do a, straight on virus lab. Okay, the other ways that you can grow up viruses are using live animals. And here's one that I think is super interesting. One place that works really well to cultivate viruses is in the foot pads of armadillos. Okay, now just think about that for a minute. First of all, who would think of using an armadillo? And then why would you think, oh gosh, those foot pads, I bet they'd be great for it. So that's always been kind of amazing to me. The best way currently still, and it's been this way for a long time, is using bird embryos, which is another way of saying an egg, basically. For some reason, really good quality virus, and especially when you need virus to help make vaccines, it's the best way to do it is to grow it up in an egg. And unfortunately, it's very labor intensive. To me, it's more of, the people who do this, the technicians it's more art than science. In my opinion, because you literally, let's see if I show it right here. Yeah. So you have to, inject the virus in very specific locations, let it incubate, take it back out, inject it somewhere else, and then take it back out, put it somewhere else. So, I mean, the people who do this, it must have first of all, really, really steady hands and, really know their anatomy as to where they're injecting the virus. The dream is to be able to use, genetic recombinant DNA technology, where you could just take the gene for a really good, say, hunk of the viral capsid, put that into a plasmid, put that inside bacteria, and then it would produce tons of that, which, would make vaccines really readily available and really inexpensive. Unfortunately, biotech hasn't gotten to the point where, they can do this on a mass scale and have really high quality vaccine. A lot of it is still done in eggs, which limits the quantity, and it also takes more time. So that's why you'll see, things like I just recently got the shingles vaccine, and it had been about 6 months since my pharmacy had it in stock. And when you hear of offices, we're running out of the flu vaccine, so you better hurry up and get your shot. So these are things also that, companies that are scrambling now to try to come up with a vaccine to COVID-19 are dealing with. And also the fact that COVID-19, once we get a vaccine, what if it mutates and then becomes a totally, unique virus that, who knows, could be potentially even more deadly. So, I think the general population is like, well, why can't you just create a vaccine? Hurry up. Well, guess what? There's a lot that goes into it. Simply just the biology and the basic virology of it, plus human trials. I mean, it's not an easy thing. So we all have to have patience while we're waiting for that COVID-19 vaccine to come around. So one of the types of viruses that we actually can grow up in lab, but you have to still have a pretty sterile facility, are using bacteriophages. Okay, so remember, if viruses, you're not going to be able to, swab those onto an agar plate and then have them grow nice little colonies like we do with bacteria, that are visible in about 24 hours. With viruses, it's actually the opposite. So here's an example of viruses that are being grown in bacteria. So these are bacteriophages, and it's kind of the opposite of looking for colonies. So if you look right here, here's a plate, and the bacteria is all around here, and then you see these, oh, nice, Amy, kind of negative spots or clear spots. Those are what we refer to as plaques, and that is where the virus is actually replicating itself. And you can see it also if you look at the regular bacteria versus here you see that cytopathic effect as well. But anywhere you see a clear zone, it's because the bacteriophage is causing the bacteria to lyse, and so you have a clear zone. You don't see bacteria growing anymore. Okay, but that's what viral plaques are. All right, so let's talk about the medical importance of viruses. So, and this still is true for the majority of viruses, but kind of COVID-19 is so unique that a couple of these don't apply to it. So most viruses cause acute infections where we get sick, but we don't have to go to the hospital. Okay, so the common cold, we're all going to pick up colds especially as we go through winter, and we deal with them. It's kind of a nuisance, but then they go away. Hepatitis A, which is, as I mentioned, is no fun. You're going to get jaundiced and very sick, but it's going to go away and you're going to clear the virus. Okay, plus of all, there's a vaccine for Hep A too, which would be great. And, this is changing a little bit, okay? So most viruses don't cause death, but those that do can have very high mortality rates. Now, obviously, COVID-19 would be put in here as well, but where we had seen it prior to the pandemic was in rates of influenza. So the strains were becoming more deadly, and if a person has to be actually hospitalized for influenza, yeah, that's pretty serious. The mortality rates, and especially we're talking about those immunocompromised populations, elderly, really young, or people with other underlying health conditions. However, we have seen a trend in influenza where younger and healthier people are dying of it. So, in fact, I had a high school classmate, and this was about 3 years ago, and she was a nurse, healthy, had no other comorbidities, tested positive for influenza, went home to just kind of rest and, take care of herself, and her family came in and found her deceased. And her cause of death was due to influenza. And this was I'm old, but I'm not that old. She was probably, I think, 51 at the time. So that's really, really scary. And that seems to be increasing as well. But for the most part, viruses don't make us go to the hospital. We can kind of deal with them. Thank God we can do that, because remember, there are no absolute cure antiviral drugs. They can slow down the virus, maybe limit the effects a little bit so it doesn't suck quite as bad, but they're not going to completely get rid of a viral infection like an antibiotic can potentially do for a bacterial infection. And it's because the virus is inside our cells. Now, one thing also that happens, and this is important, so listen to this, most viruses tend to kind of lose their steam as they go through multiple viral replication cycles. So remember in my last lecture, I talked about how one virus particle can potentially infect a cell and produce 100,000 new viruses. So my God, why aren't we all dead of viruses? And it's because, first of all, we have an immune system that eventually can help fight them off. Vaccination has been invented for really serious diseases, but also it seems as though quite a few viruses tend to become weaker over time as they're going through these cycles and lysing more and more cells. So they're kind of losing their steam. At the same time, our immune system ramps up to them. And so, that kind of helps us as well. But when we're talking about viruses like Ebola and COVID-19 that have developed mechanisms that make them especially, the problem is how transmissible they are. And COVID-19 is way more transmissible than Ebola when it factors into human behavior, such as social distancing. Okay, then we have other diseases which can, we clear them, but they leave their mark. Okay, so polio is an example of that. And you guys are all too young to remember when there was a polio epidemic. I remember we all had to line up in the gym in second grade to get our polio shots. I remember being terrified. And if you look at people of my age category, we all have the exact same scar on either our left or right arm because they administered the injection with kind of a gun type instrument. So, it's kind of a mark on my generation. But polio, it affects nerve cells. And so people that had it, and especially children, they would finally get rid of the virus, but, they would have to, be in hyperbaric chambers, which the old timey word for that was iron lung. And I'm actually going to post a picture that I think will be really informative to you. And it's basically all these little kids laying in these huge wards of iron lungs, which were basically helping them breathe because polio had destroyed nerves that helped, run their respiratory response. You also saw kids, walking on, with the use of crutches or braces because of nerve damage due to polio. And the good news was, yay, polio was eradicated because we had a vaccine. And then people started to not use the vaccine. And I'm not talking about, first world anti-vaxxers. I'm talking about people in countries, say in in Eastern Europe, where they did not trust their governments, and so they were not going to let government officials inject their kids with anything because they thought, you're going to be injecting my kids with poison. I don't trust you. And so that also led to lower rates of vaccination as well. That I can kind of understand if you have a government that you really think wants to kill you. What I don't understand are people who knowingly spread misinformation about the dangers of vaccines. Just, oh, you don't even want to get me started on that. I will lose it. Okay, and okay, so then we have a category of viruses called oncoviruses. So oncoviruses, I mean, I'm sure you recognize that prefix. We normally think about it, oncology is cancer treatment. So these are viral infections, and they're always latent viruses that can potentially increase rates of cancer. And the reason is a lot of latent viruses, when their DNA inserts into the host chromosome, it's kind of willy-nilly, it inserts wherever, it happens to insert. A lot of times the person doesn't even know it because, it hits in one of the parts of DNA that doesn't do anything. However, oncoviruses tend to preferentially insert into genes that control cellular reproduction. Okay, so in your cells, you have genes that tell your cells, okay, it's time to replicate. Let's go through replication. And you have genes that tell your cells, okay, stop. We don't need to reproduce anymore. We're done with mitosis. So you can kind of look at it as your cells have genes that are like the accelerator in a car and the brakes in the car. And if viral DNA tends to insert into the accelerator genes, well, then you have a cell that's going to, basically you're pressing down on the accelerator and it's going to keep going and going and going and going, and nothing's going to shut it off. If the viral DNA happens to insert in the genes that are the brakes, then your cells aren't going to know when to stop reproducing. Either way, you're going to have cells just reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, and that produces a tumor. Okay, so oncogenes are genes that control the accelerator and the brakes of cellular reproduction, telling our cells when to reproduce and when to not reproduce. Oncoviruses, for whatever reason, insert their DNA into those specific oncogenes. And that's why you have a higher risk of cancer. They are always latent viruses. Okay, so here's some examples, and I'm sure some of these you've heard of. So HPV, and it's just particular strains of HPV that do this, can lead to much higher incidences of cervical cancer. I believe the current vaccine, that we have, I think covers, I want to say between 8 and 15 different strains of HPV, so that's great. Epstein-Barr, which I had mentioned this before, this is what causes mono or infectious mononucleosis, which in the United States, we can kind of laugh it off, big deal, you sleep a lot, you're going to get over it. But as I mentioned, in countries that have a very high degree or a high incidence of malaria, it's almost like their immune system says, okay, we can fight the malaria or we can fight off Epstein-Barr, and it chooses malaria. And so Epstein-Barr will insert itself into oncogenes, and it can produce certain types of lymphomas, specifically one called Burkitt's lymphoma. And then hepatitis C, which we've talked about, can produce liver cancer because it's inserting into, liver cells, the accelerator and the brakes genes. So those are examples of oncoviruses. So here is something super important. You need to understand this because you're going to have to explain this to your patients over and over again. Viruses are not bacteria. So giving the patient an antibiotic does Nothing. And in fact, what it'll do is it'll wipe out a bunch of the normal bacteria, and then you're susceptible to what we call super infections. So if you're the ones that are going to have to explain to, let's say you have a parent that's been sitting at urgent care for 4 hours because it's really crowded, and they have a super crabby child that has snot coming out of their nose and they're just miserable, and so the parent is exhausted too, and they finally come back into the treatment room, and you're the one that has to tell them, this is a viral infection. You need to take your child home, give them chicken noodle soup, have them rest, give them fluids. There are a lot of people out there that if they don't get a prescription for something when they leave the doctor's office, there is hell to pay. Growing up, when I was basically a child in the late 60s, 1970s, every single time my mom took me to the family doctor, she got a prescription for antibiotics for me. And they were just way, way overprescribed. Now we've learned, guess what? That produces superbugs, so don't do that. But you're going to have patients that, man, they are irate because they just want a pill that's going to fix everything and let their kid go to sleep so they can have, life go back to normal. And you're the ones who are going to have to educate them to say, listen, it's actually a really good thing that I don't have to give your child an antibiotic, because the more antibiotics you give, that makes them more susceptible to superbugs, and it can mess up and allow them to get other infections. Okay, so not going to be fun for you. This is why you got to have your people skills and a lot of patience. God love you. That's why I could never be a nurse. Okay, so there are some antiviral drugs like Tamiflu, acyclovir. So yeah, they do target one of the steps in the viral. Oh, and this is wrong. Oh my God, I'm changing this right now. There's no life cycle because viruses aren't alive. Okay, it's their replication cycle. I am a horrible teacher. I should be ashamed. Okay. Lord. Okay, so that is corrected. In the viral replication cycle, like AZT, okay, attacking reverse transcriptase. Once again, viruses are inside your cells, so it's hard to find drugs that are totally effective. One thing that's showing potential success is interferon, synthetic interferon. However, this is something that, you don't want to go in and say, hey, you know what? I'm having a really bad cold. I have rhinovirus. Can I have some interferon? No, this is for super serious infections, and especially with oncogenes, because interferon, synthetic interferon, when it's given to a patient, it has side effects that are very similar to going through chemotherapy for a cancer, which we all know is certainly no picnic. So the bottom line, get vaccinated, okay? Do vaccines cause autism? No. Totally disproven, okay? That is a load of crap. If I had a child, which, oh my God, that would never happen, or if I had friends who have kids, do I tell them, yep, vaccinate? Absolutely. Because, the benefits of vaccination so far outweigh the side effects of vaccination. Also, when you vaccinate, you're helping your community because you're increasing what we call herd immunity. And we'll get to that. But the bottom line is a vaccine, which is usually a hunk of the viral capsid, is going to cause your immune system to develop antibodies against that virus or that part of the capsid. So guess what? When you get infected with that virus, your immune system and those antibodies are all over it. And they basically, surround that virus and remove it from your system before it ever reaches your cells. And that's the best way to prevent viral infections, because once they reach your cells, they're inside your cells and it's kind of too late, okay? Because you would have to destroy your own cells to get at the virus and destroy the virus. So yeah, I am totally pro-vaccination. If you have any vaccine-related questions, I'm probably not going to do an anti-vaccine lecture because I'd probably get fired because anti-vaxxers make me so angry. Not only because they're putting their own kids at risk, but because they're putting everyone else's kids at risk. And every single person who has an immunocompromised, or is immunocompromised or has a weak immune system. Okay, it's kind of the way with COVID-19, like people going out and not social distancing. Yeah, you're probably not going to get sick, but guess what? You can potentially cause the deaths of people who are weaker, who have a weaker immune system. So, quit being so selfish. Take one for the team and stay home. Okay, actually, I am going to wait and do one more lecture because we have to cover prions, which are different from viruses. So I'm going to get this in the next lecture. I'm going to get this one uploaded, and yeah, we'll go from there. So look for the prion lecture later today. Okay, hang in there, guys.